First of all, a big thanks on behalf of the UN system in Asia and the Pacific to the organizers of this meeting, and particularly our friends and colleagues in ADB. My job today is to share with you the report called Switched On that was put together by 13 UN agencies working in different kinds of development issues together with the ADB. And the purpose of this report is to analyze through the lens of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development the current state of youth in the Asian Pacific region and how to ensure a better present and future for all of you and for the people of the region in general. It's called Switched On because we need you, the young people of the region, to be fully switched on. Your capacities as human beings, as citizens, and as leaders fully developed and activated, and your hearts and intellects fully engaged in changing our region and the world for the better. And before I get into the report, I just wanted to speak briefly on the 2030 Agenda itself. And as was mentioned, I've spent over 30 years in the UN system, so I'm not easily impressed usually by these grand initiatives that come out from my organization. But I do really believe that the SDGs represent an unprecedented global agreement to make development work for all people, not just some. It is an agenda that seeks to bring together all different aspects of life, the economic, the social, the environmental, also how we're governed and how we live together as societies. And it's all bundled together under those 5 Ps that were already mentioned. It does propose to build a better world for all people, leaving no one behind. That's the new slogan. And that means correcting the inequalities left by the MDG process, despite the great progress that it has achieved, and based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that tells us that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights. And it very much emphasizes, as you know, this idea of transformation. And I think that means a different vision of what constitutes a good life. And the idea that it's not just about the material well-being of people, but about caring, people and countries caring for one another and also for nature, other forms of life, and also about striving for fairness and justice. And as was already mentioned, young people, you were very much a part of shaping this agenda. There was very broad participation in the SDGs debate, and not only by governments, but by people of very diverse parts of societies and age groups, including there were consultations specifically with young people, both globally and at country level. And in fact, a global survey done as part of the lead up to the 2030 Agenda, young people in this region identified, that was already mentioned, education and health as 2 of the big priorities, and also honest and responsive government. So those were the 3 top priorities that you identified as a lead up to the SDGs. And all in all, over 5 million people contributed to the debate, whether in face-to-face dialogue or by virtual means. And because of this, I do think there is more of a commitment and a public expectation and pressure to truly move forward on this agenda. And this really is an unprecedented thing. It really was an effort to open up and democratize the United Nations. And even though the 2030 Agenda is still largely a promise, it is really significant that 193 countries in the world signed on to this agenda willingly. And in that sense, the 2030 Agenda shows us one of the main reasons why the United Nations continues to be important. And it's as a space for countries to come together, regardless of differences, and through often long and complicated negotiations. And you know, the 2030 Agenda wasn't just suddenly agreed to last year. It's a product of many, many years of dialogue and debate about how development should be. And it did lead to this agreement on a better path for the world. And it really is important that it was an agreement achieved through dialogue and without coercion. And that's what the United Nations is about. And so we do need to seize this opportunity and start pushing things forward now. And we need you to do that. One, because you are such a big and important part of the better world that we're trying to build. Suzanne mentioned that there are over 700 million young persons in the Asia-Pacific region. It's about a fifth of the total population here. And if we're going to change the way we think about and work on development, like the 2030 Agenda is calling on us to do, we can't do that without your capacity to imagine a different world. And the faith and the energy you're capable of to turn that vision into reality. And Suzanne mentioned the example of getting rid of apartheid. And I thought I would mention that in these long years that I've worked in the UN, one of my first jobs was in Central America in the 1980s, when most of those countries were at war. And I have to say that it was, and I was a young person then, but it was different. It was difficult to imagine that those wars would end. But they did end thanks to people who were capable of imagining a different Central America at peace. And also not only capable of imagining it, but just, you know, through dogged, persistent effort, making that imagination into reality. So it's possible to change things. Now, to quickly give you a summary of what the findings of the report are, the report is organized under those 5 Ps. So to start with people, and that heading has to do with ending poverty, hunger, promoting food security, health, and well-being. And it is important to recognize that our region has had a lot of success in reducing extreme poverty, from 52% to 18% since 1990. Yet, still nearly 100 million young people live in extreme poverty in our region. They face great difficulties in exercising their right to quality education, to health services, to decent work. Their access to food and nutrition is precarious, and those engaged in smallholder agriculture get very little support from governments. Adolescents are especially vulnerable to HIV and sexually transmitted diseases, to drug abuse, to violence, and girls in particular face a high risk of unwanted pregnancies. So the report recommends better and stronger public policies to address those issues, including well-coordinated poverty eradication programs, more support to smallholder agriculture, youth-friendly health services, and better support to migrant youth. On Planet, that looks at protection of the environment and combating climate change. And climate change is already causing rising sea levels, extreme weather events that hit the poor and the marginalized harder, thereby worsening the inequalities that already exist. And Asia and the Pacific is the world's most disaster-prone region. There's also massive rural urban migration and unplanned urbanization leading to millions living in slums, without basic services, without decent work. and many live without access to safe water and sanitation, and girls are especially affected when they have no access to decent bathrooms, especially when they're having their periods. It's an affront to their dignity. They also travel long distances to fetch water. And the report calls for expanding those basic services and decent housing in urban areas, access to water and sanitation, also for encouraging the participation of young people in disaster risk reduction and promoting sustainable production and consumption. On prosperity, and this is about inclusive and sustainable economic growth, the report points out that universal access to decent work is key, yet too many still are excluded from this possibility. And when young people do work, they tend to be engaged in informal or vulnerable employment. So they're working, but living in poverty. And many who want to start their own businesses lack access to financing and technical support. And too many young people are not receiving academic education or vocational training. And all this is increasing, again, the already high level of inequality. So the report calls on us to improve access to quality education, vocational training, career counseling, as well as to social protection. It urges us to make decent jobs, including the protections of workers' rights, a top political priority. On peace, as you know, among the SDGs is the goal to build peaceful and inclusive societies with transparent and accountable governments, with universal access to justice. Asian Pacific is a region of great cultural, ethnic, and ideological diversity, and that's the most important wealth of our region. But people in the region have not yet fully embraced this diversity. So we see violent conflicts, tendencies toward fundamentalism, extremism, intolerance leading to violations of human rights. Violence against women and girls is still too common. So the report calls on engagement of youth as active citizens, and especially encouraging political participation, including in voting and running for and occupying public office, to combat exclusion and fight discrimination in all its forms, and especially violence against women and girls. And finally, partnership, and that's about how young people can work together to make the SDGs a reality. Among other things, the report sees great potential in information and communication technology for bringing young people from diverse sectors of society together and getting their voices heard. But it also points out that internet access is still uneven across and within countries, so it calls for bridging the digital divide to ensure access to ICT for all youth, and also to promote integrated urban and rural development, so that both the countryside and the cities become spaces where a life of dignity is possible. So these are very general findings and recommendations, and they're not meant to be recipes or prescriptions or cure-alls. So for this report to be useful, we need you, the young people, to analyze these findings and recommendations, to think about them, criticize them, adjust them to your specific realities, and come up with concrete actions to move things forward. And the difficult thing is to do this in such a way that you build dialogue and consensus between people with very different beliefs and interests that are often in conflict with one another, and between people who sometimes don't even want to talk to one another. But that's what it means when the 2030 Agenda talks about leaving no one behind and building inclusive societies, and about partnerships. And one important principle in reaching that consensus is that even though every single person counts, when you decide on what's the priority and what's urgent, those farthest behind have to come first. The people who have been the most excluded, the most marginalized, the most vulnerable have to come first. In our region, this means the poorest people, both in the cities and in the countryside, those with disabilities, indigenous peoples. It's important to remember in that sense that it was yesterday, it was the International Day for Indigenous Peoples. Ethnic and religious minorities, lower caste people, LGBT persons, migrants, refugees, stateless people, sex workers, people addicted to drugs, people living with HIV, and often women and girls. This is a difficult and complicated and time-consuming political process, bringing all these people together, forging that consensus, making sure that those who are excluded now come first. And it's often a frustrating one because what you get in the end might not be all you aspired for. And for young people in particular, and especially for those of you who hold high ideals and aspire to big and important changes as quickly as possible, this is going to be a challenge. But there are no shortcuts if we are serious about being inclusive and leaving no one behind. Now, these days we are faced with what feels like an avalanche of disheartening stories of violence born of hatred and intolerance of differences. We worry about shrinking space for people of all beliefs to freely express their opinions and demand their rights to those in power. But we need to push back on that and expand that space for all of us to look at one another and recognize each other as people with the same right to that life of dignity the 2030 Agenda calls for. We need to listen to those whose beliefs and interests are different from our own, who have beliefs that we don't agree with, that we don't like, and to try to put ourselves in their place. And that's in all my 30-some years working for the UN and including in issues of conflict prevention. It's one of the most difficult things for human beings to do. But we appeal to you, the young people of the Asia and Pacific region, to take on that challenge and to persevere in this difficult task, and not to give in to the temptation of thinking that violence or repression are solutions. Because youth has to be about possibility and discovery and serendipity, about opening up and reaching out to others, and not about closing ourselves off from the new and the different and the unknown, however scary those may seem, and not about turning away from our fellow human beings, however different they may seem from us. So we look to you to lead us on that path of building this dialogue and collective effort among very diverse groups of people to build nations and societies that can embrace all of us. It will be a difficult path, full of obstacles and setbacks, but I wanted to recall here the words of Martin Luther King in describing the struggle for civil rights in the US. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So let's together make it bend further and sooner. Thank you very much.